Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there are observers of transhumanism that have accused it of a sort of neo-Pelagianism. So the Pelagian heresy basically denied the existence of original sin and was convinced to some degree that we would be able, through our own efforts and discipline, to correct our human defects apart from grace and achieve salvation apart from that grace. So this sort of neo-Pelagianism comes up in contemporary transhumanism. Again, not because they're explicitly thinking in these theological terms, because they're often not.
But they might not even know that. They might be repackaging.
Right.
Again, it's like there's also the claim there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a repackaging of another a heresy that we've seen before.
Right. And so there's this tremendous pressure, if you will, on them to figure this out, to get the next generation right.
Welcome back to For Pete's Sake, a Vatican podcast offering you a front seat view into Catholic life in and around the Vatican. I'm your host, James O'Reilly, and I'm joined today by Father Michael Baggot. Father Baggot is an associate professor of bioethics at the Regina Apostolorum and a visiting professor of theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Angelicum. He also serves as a professor for the Joint Diploma in Leadership, Service through Virtues in the Catholic Worldview Fellowship Summer Program. Father Baggot, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You were born in Texas, I hear.
That's right.
But you are a Virginia man in terms of where you were raised. Which part of Virginia?
I grew up in a quaint, beautiful little town called Winchester, home of Patsy Cline, the great country musician.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm from Front Royal, which is 30 minutes down the road, and I didn't even know that. So, it's when you go to cities and most of the people who actually live in the city haven't done the touristy things or don't know the touristy things, I guess that's Winchester for me. But Patsy Cline, all right.
The inexhaustible cultural richness of Winchester, Virginia.
Yeah. And then that's Sacred Heart, the parish, is the parish there, right?
That's right. Okay. Sacred Heart of Jesus in Winchester. It's actually the church I was baptized, confirmed, and where I received First Holy Communion on Easter Vigil when I was a high school senior.
Okay.
So every Easter Vigil is a special moment for me to relive that experience of grace.
That really is. I mean, of course, growing up in Front Royal down the road, I've been to Sacred Heart several times. I actually I was one of the counselors for their summer program that they started the last 5-6 years. So I'm well familiar with the parish, and it's a lovely place. Being raised in Virginia, then, how did you go from, small town, Winchester's a decent sized place, but go from the Shenandoah Valley, Winchester, to teaching bioethics in Rome?
It's been quite a journey. I started to travel a little bit when I was in college, made a trip to Europe to see Spain and France, and then I was eventually able to come over to Rome to work for a study abroad program. But then I entered into priestly formation and was sent initially off to Germany, then came back to the U.S., spent some time in Mexico, back to the U.S., and then finally was sent over to Rome for a few years of philosophy and theology studies. Really fell in love with the city and was thrilled when I was asked to stay here after my ordination. I was ordained a deacon in St. Peter's Basilica and a priest in St. Paul's. So I was destined to stay in Rome with the two patrons by my side, Peter and Paul.
Yeah, and when was that, the ordinations?
2017.
Okay.
May 13th, 2017.
Okay.
A deacon in St. Peter's, and December 16th, 2017, I was ordained a priest in St. Paul outside the walls. The diaconate ordination was on the 100th anniversary of the Fatima apparitions.
Wow.
And the priestly ordination was on my mother's birthday, which was a special gift.
Your two moms there.
That's right.
That's awesome. And then was that your legionnaires? So
that's right.
Your travels to Europe and elsewhere before ordination, that was all through legionnaires formation?
No. These were other visits that I had done as a lay person.
Okay, cool. And the question of bioethics, how did that lead you into something like transhumanism? Because you speak a lot about transhumanism, but I think most people aren't really familiar with that term. What does bioethics have to do with transhumanism?
Right. So I had been very interested in bioethics even before I entered the Catholic Church, because I would have these debates with other members of my high school class about all sorts of issues, including hot button bioethical issues like abortion and others. And through the influence of an atheist friend of mine who argued against abortion and in favor of the dignity of unborn life, I became convinced of his perspective, changed my mind on the issue, and started to rethink a lot of other bioethical themes. And that actually helped to lead me through a journey of reflection on what even grounded the moral law. And I eventually arrived at an objective, transcendent moral lawgiver, thanks to the thinking of St. John Henry Newman and C.S. Lewis and a lot of other key thinkers. So these bioethical issues played a role in my conversion, and then later in my formation, I was exposed to the UNESCO chair in bioethics and human rights that is associated with Regina Apostolorum, our Pontifical university. I was then introduced to a lot of the activities that took place, and including an art show that we put on, a bioethics art show at the UN headquarters in New York. And I began to explore more and more what was happening in the world of bioethics. I was asked to specialize in that area after my ordination in doctoral studies. And that's how I discovered transhumanism, because I wanted to see which issues still needed more exploration, work, reflection. And I saw people like Leon Kass, who was for many years the president of the President's Council of Bioethics. And even though he was an expert on a lot of the traditional bioethical issues, he thought it was very important to address these new developments of transhumanism, basically these efforts to radically enhance the human species, to make us stronger, fitter, emotionally happier, help us to become smarter, perhaps, through cognitive enhancement, to live longer, maybe even forever. And so he and his team actually published a book years ago, before most people were thinking about transhumanism, called Beyond Therapy. And he was wrestling seriously with some of the leading bioethicists of the President's Council. But I realized, looking at that work, as good as it was, there were still so many new issues to address. So I thought, I should devote some time and energy to this, and other people encouraged me to continue. I was really worried that I was just going to be wasting my time on sci-fi. It would have no relevance after I was done. But hey, I wouldn't be the first person to write an irrelevant doctoral dissertation, but
and
I wanted to avoid it.
Yeah, that makes sense. With the bioethics of that day and what they were addressing, people like Leon Kass, what would be some of the traditional elements of that bioethicists were looking at? Because of course, abortion would have been a big one in the 60s, 70s, and now you have IVF and things like that. But could you explain some of the kind of traditional elements that the bioethicists of Leon Kass's generation would have been addressing?
Sure. So bioethics is focused primarily on looking at the morality of acts associated with the healthcare system, with the life sciences, and looking at how different technologies are used to intervene on the body and affect people. So bioethicists have been looking at the impact of different forms of human experimentation, abortion, different issues related to assisted reproduction. They've been looking at end-of-life issues and how people navigate questions about euthanasia, assisted suicide. So these different technological interventions on the body have been central to bioethics. Certainly, bioethics is broadly understood in society over the last few decades, though I think a good argument can be made that Catholics have been thinking seriously about these kinds of bioethical issues to some degree, even earlier through the long tradition of moral theology.
Yeah. Well, could you say even traces back to something like the Council of Nicaea and trying to discern something even like the nature of Christ as God and man, and that kind of duality of man too, in a sense? Because if you're
Yeah.
struggling with the question of Christology and the human side of Christ, then you also have to reckon with, well, what is human at that point too? So even those kind of like the seeds of these
Right.
questions were already being planted for the way we consider and address the questions now into the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah, because so often in bioethics, I am grateful for my formation in metaphysics because my philosophy master's was focused on metaphysics.
Yeah.
And they seem perhaps at first unrelated, but so often these bioethical issues, these very practical concerns, bring us back to these more foundational claims. I mean,
Right.
if we want to talk about how we're going to produce or presumably improve upon the next generation through artificial reproduction, right? Given all of these proposals to harness IVF, to build a superior species, this is a type of project that comes up in the context of transhumanism, then inevitably we run up against the question of, well, what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with raw biological material subject to our interventions? Or are these actually human beings, even human persons, with an intrinsic worth that we cannot or we ought not to damage and manipulate? So these practical questions about what we're going to do about the future in transhumanism and in these other schools of thought inevitably brings us back to these foundational metaphysical, anthropological questions like you were saying.
Yeah. And then you would have had some sort of precedent. You have the different trans movements, of course, well, it's transgenderism. Again, these maybe reduced notions of human nature that drive the movements. But for people who might be confused, what would be even something like the difference between transgenderism and transhumanism? Where are they alike and where are they different?
Yes. So transhumanism is typically presented as the intellectual and cultural movement to radically enhance the human species through various technologies. And that enhancement or that improvement going beyond the normal, going beyond our standard conception of health, that takes place at the cognitive level, at the emotional level, at the physical level, even at the moral level. There are some claims that we can enhance ourselves morally. It's a kind of combination of cognitive, so we judge moral issues better, and mood or emotional, so that we're better motivated to be altruistic and collaborate to face moral challenges. So that's the basic understanding of moving from cognitive and mood into moral enhancement. And then lifespan enhancement, which often means giving us more healthy years, but for quite a few transhumanists, to go beyond even death, to cure sickness, cure death, reverse aging.
Isn't there that one guy on social media who's trying to do that? I'm completely blanking his
Brian
name.
Johnson?
I think so,
Yes. Yeah, his message is pretty clear and simple. Don't die. Don't die.
Right.
So I was actually just watching his latest intense morning routine with some of my students in a little course I did on, a short course I did on transhumanism.
Okay.
And he has refined his blueprint. So he did a documentary years ago on Netflix where he went through the very complicated eating, exercise, sleep ritual that he had. He's learned a thing or two as the most measured man in all of human history. So he simplified the protocol, but if you watch the intense morning routine, you realize it's still not for the faint of heart. It's pretty demanding. So he has a whole procedure to study the impact of food and exercise and sleep and different drugs and treatments on his body. He claims to have sort of physiologically reversed his biological age. So, of course, he goes forward like the rest of us chronologically in his chronological age, but he claims physiologically that he's actually younger than before. And he's created a whole movement. He jokingly, half-jokingly, calls it a kind of cult. So he's really rallied people around him. Now, I don't mean to totally bash what he's doing, because there are a lot of principles of sound diet and exercise that we can learn from, and we should care for our bodies and be good stewards of our bodies. But there are also some questionable experimental procedures, and then just the deeper question of how well is he living as he's extending his life. You know, how much of this effort to optimize life is actually taking away from other beautiful aspects of life, like worship and aesthetic delight and friendship
leisure.
And leisure and relationships and so forth. So these are pretty serious questions that come up when you see them.
I mean, this gets into the more like sci-fi stuff, but it seems like that's the kind of mentality that you would see at the end of like C.S. Lewis's Space trilogy, where it's just like it's them just trying to keep the body alive, and there's just this head at the end that they're keeping alive through the machine. And it's not, of course, that he's doing that, and I don't think anyone would want to live in existence like that. But do you think that kind of thinking taken to the extreme would lead to tendencies like that, where it's, you know, it's not just about living a healthy life and extending the period, it's about grasping at something?
Yeah, I think that grasping aspect can come in quite a bit. I've often talked about how influential secularism is on contemporary transhumanism. There are transhumanists who present themselves as Christian transhumanists. There are Mormon transhumanists. There are various transhumanists who want to maintain a spiritual outlook and dimension. But quite a few of the most influential of the transhumanists today very clearly identify as secular. Brian Johnson himself grew up as a Mormon, but came to reject Mormonism. And the reason I bring that up is because if you're in a universe where there is no God, and in which you really only have this single life and no serious hope in something beyond, no serious hope in grace or elevation, then I'm sympathetic to the effort to grasp at what we have here and to try to use our best tools of technology to make it as pleasurable, enjoyable for as long as possible.
Yeah. What would be, I mean, in this specific example then, because he seems to be pretty popular, when you're addressing the ethical and moral dimensions of his movement or his cult, how do you address them on a moral and ethical level in a way that secular people could even understand? Because of course, like you're saying, based on his worldview and the premises that he's built his life on, you can understand why he acts the way he does, and he would pursue this end. How do you speak to that on the moral and ethical level in a language that they would understand, that you can actually show maybe why it's off?
Yeah, so I would say we can affirm some of the positive elements of it, but also help them to appreciate that there are aspects and dimensions of life that bring joy and fulfillment apart from optimizing our physical state, right? We know all sorts of schools of psychology, like positive psychology out of UPenn, really emphasize the centrality of relationships and quality time with the ones we love, and also the capacity to enter into awe and wonder. They also speak of a transcendent dimension, which for them is not necessarily a religious experience or contact with God, but could include that. So I think there are these certain dimensions of our life, of happiness, of satisfaction, that so many people talk about as valuable as they near the end of their life, and so many people regret not having devoted more time and energy to their family, to their friends, to relationship, to God. I mean, I saw Ben Sasse is recently giving interviews, and I think even started a podcast, I'm not dead yet, from Monty Python. Yeah. Basically talking about the lessons he wants to impart.
I saw the one he did with Ross Douthat on New York Times. Is excellent.
Yeah. And there, it's very striking that he talks about how he wishes he lived the Sabbath better. Yeah. So he wishes he gave real priority to rest, leisure, and the highest form of leisure, worship. He wishes that he had been a lot more selective in his travel, right? That instead of perhaps accomplishment, success, breakthrough, he simply rested, relished what he had done, and shared that with people he cared about. He says he wished he lived close to his parents. He wished he had spent quality time with them.
Intergenerational living.
Right. So I think Johnson Brian Johnson shows some signs of this appreciation, at least when it comes to relationships. In the Don't Die documentary, he's really happy when he's able to reestablish contact with his son. They were somewhat estranged, and they do some weird things like blood transfusion. So Brian gets blood transfusion from his son.
You can throw the baseball in the backyard, or you can do blood transfusions.
Yeah, there's different games out there. And so there's this odd sort of bonding that takes place, but there is something beautiful about that. You can see Brian recognizes that he's really losing out on something when his son, who's growing up, goes off to college. So I don't want to say this is absent from Brian's thinking, but I think that the model of the protocol, the focus on optimization, the kind of ruthless effort to cheat death and aging begins to quickly crowd out these key essential relationships, relationships with the divine, and then also with our neighbors and our loved one. And it prevents us from really losing ourselves in that rejoicing in a good meal, even though the protocol tells us that we can only eat certain items, or we only should eat certain items because every calorie has to fight for its place in our body, and we should end our meals by 11 a.m. so that we have the best chance to digest. That obviously is going to be a little bit contrary to some of the enriching experiences that we can pursue in life. And I think it also just sets us up for a lot of disappointment when we cling to this life. I think one of the beautiful things about the Catholic worldview, shifting from maybe a more secular, philosophical, psychological approach to the Catholic view, is to say, well, you can do all of this stewarding. You can care for your body, you can exercise, you can diet, you can try to improve your health and preserve your health, but you were made for something even more than that. And you want to cultivate these relationships, this pursuit of beauty, pursuit of God. And even in those cases in which physical health eludes you, maybe for no fault of your own, right? You've been injured, you have a disease, you get in an accident, whatever that may be, even when that perfect health and that possibility to optimize your health eludes you, you can still have such a profoundly meaningful and valuable life. And that itself is a preparation for an even higher life of union with God.
Yeah. With transhumanism, I mean, you have certain spokespeople for it. Would you say that it is a sort of cohesive, it's not a movement, but a cohesive system of thought where there's actually, certain principles that every transhumanist agrees on? Or is it just a patchwork of different ideologies and philosophies that we've inherited from, different times throughout history, the Enlightenment, Renaissance, humanistic elements? Where does it actually fit in within human society? Is there some sort of like specific group that are transhumanists, or is it, again, just a mix of people with different views that are transhumanistic?
Yeah, back in 1998, there was the foundation of a World Transhumanist Association, which was really the first major international gathering of a lot of thinkers who shared these common ideals about improving the human species, radically enhancing us, overcoming sickness, suffering, aging, death. There had definitely been thinkers of that mindset before that. The extropians had gathered to some degree.
The extropians?
Extropians. Instead of entropy, they're the extropians. So instead of just allowing things to sort of drift into disorder and chaos, they were going to put order and direction into life and even into our sort of evolutionary development.
Okay.
So they had already begun to gather as a group, but not until the World Transhumanist Association did you have this kind of international gathering that also started to produce maybe some unifying documents and principles.
More of an institutional base.
Right. So I don't think every member agrees about each point, every single point. There's not a creed that they all have to recite or, dogmas that they have to profess. They don't have to take an oath of fidelity to the transhumanist creed.
Right.
But there are definitely shared ideas that come out in some of the documents. Then that World Transhumanist Association rebranded as Humanity Plus. So that same idea of enhancement, like humanity, but even better, right? A new version or a higher version of it. So Humanity Plus has been with us for a while. They put together over the years various versions of a fascinating document called the Frequently Asked Questions. Now you go to a website, you get frequently asked questions. Maybe it's just a few paragraphs. This one is much more thorough. And I think it's one of the most comprehensive, clear, intriguing documents of transhumanist thinking. And it was co-authored by a whole team of major transhumanist thinkers. Nick Bostrom was one of the lead authors. Nick Bostrom is a Swedish philosopher who taught for many years at the University of Oxford. He's moved on, and he was asked to move on. And he's a key philosopher in the movement who's written extensively in various essays and also in a few book projects about the ideals. He had a book called Superintelligence in 2014, where he was looking at the impact of AI systems that advanced to the point where not only were they capable basically of all cognitively significant human tasks, but they could also exceed humans, so super intelligence. And he was thinking seriously about, well, how do we keep this aligned with human values, and how do we keep this from getting out of control and destroying us potentially as an existential risk? Interestingly enough, while he's still very concerned about those existential risks, his most recent book from a few years ago is called Deep Utopia, which is looking at what happens if we get this kind of advanced AI system right, and we enter into a society of post-scarcity, where we're able to automate so many of the aspects of our current economic system, and we're basically left with this abundance of time for exploration, for creative pursuits, and for new delights. And so he's trying to wrestle with that. Like, okay, what do we do when we don't have to do anything? Like when we don't have to do it for economic utility. So he's been quite an intriguing thinker also through a lot of his essays, but he works closely with people like Anders Sandberg, who was a collaborator. And Anders Sandberg developed this notion of morphological freedom. So basically we have the right to use these emerging technologies to reshape and transform our body according to our own preferences, our own desires, our own life project. So I think when you get to these thinkers, you start to see how trends like secularism are at work, but also often a kind of postmodernism. This postmodernism challenges the notion that there's some sort of fixed objective human nature with inbuilt purposes. It challenges the notion that there's a meta-narrative, like a story that unites us. And we're really left with private narratives. We're left with our own stories. We're also left blurring distinctions between different creatures and even between the human and the machine. So that kind of opens us up to a lot of these different radical changes and these blending with machines. And then there's also this sort of libertarianism where you want to get the government out of these decisions, and you want to...
Most transhumanists would have libertarian tendencies?
Well, there are elements of that. So I would say that there is a strong streak of political liberalism understood in a Millian sense, like John Stuart Mill, that you really want to give as much space as possible for the individual to pursue a personally chosen life project. And it's not the role of society to decide on the good life or the good society. The role of this organization or this group is basically to protect individual liberties and individual decisions and keep people from harming each other. So the state has a role in preventing harm, but is not going to really enshrine or promote a particular view of human nature and the human good. So that strong sense of personal autonomy, which has been very present in a lot of different bioethical issues, right? We can think about how often autonomy language comes up in defending abortion, how often autonomy language comes up in this sense of death with dignity, right? To defend euthanasia, assisted suicide. So this strong, strong emphasis on personal autonomy has been with us for a while, part of that particular liberal tradition. So I'm not at all dismissing other forms of liberalism or democratic government or anything like that. But that particular focus on personal autonomy, which sometimes gets played out in a more libertarian approach that says we don't want state governments to intervene and be restrictive in how these emerging technologies are governed so that different individuals can actually use them to fulfill their projects. So these ideas come out in various thinkers. Like I said, we have Bostrom, we have Sandberg, we have David Pierce was a key co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association, and he was very much hoping to reduce and maybe even eliminate suffering. So you see some pretty ambitious goals. And
did he actually write a book on how you get rid of suffering?
he wrote this kind of manifesto, the hedonist imperative, with some suggestions, but they're clearly still working on this. And what strikes me too about the transhumanist is that a lot of these contemporary transhumanists who are very secular, who are very much opposed to the limits of organized religion or to the limits of what they perceive as this kind of outdated notion of God, that even though they think a lot of these traditional religions have failed to deliver on their promises, the secular transhumanists often draw on Judeo-Christian ideas, and they claim to basically be doing what these earlier religions failed to do. So secular transhumanists say, okay, we also want to deal with sickness, aging, suffering, and death. We just think we need a good technological solution to it rather than faith in the divine to have it. So they often see themselves as a kind of superior alternative to what came before. But then other outside critics of transhumanists have sometimes said, well, you're actually repackaging, representing Christianity to create a kind of a new quasi-religion that still demands faith, that still demands hope in this unspecified future, in this sort of eventual singularity point of breakthrough, or this point in which these enemies will finally be defeated. And you're asking your followers, if you will, to basically make these acts of faith in the future and great sacrifice so that these goals at an unspecified time might finally be realized.
It's, for me, I always find it with transhumanistic tendencies, it seems like something like eugenics, even within that, because that would be, I'm trying to, I guess, square the libertarian aspect with something like this new meta-narrative that they have, where if they're trying to convince people of this, I feel like it's hard to square the libertarian tendencies with this, again, worldview that they're trying to create in a certain way.
Yeah, no,
because you would have to kind of create a system and then try to draw people in and evangelize them to this cause as well.
Yeah, you're right to point out some of these tensions. But on the point of eugenics, it's quite interesting because many of the influential contemporary transhumanists are quite interested in utilizing gene editing eventually, but in the short term, assisted reproduction, like in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, to actively choose those embryos that seem to have the best chance of the best life, so that we can produce a better future generation. So the transhumanists get accused often of eugenics, and Many of them are uncomfortable with that term. Some accept it so long as you distinguish between old eugenics and new liberal eugenics. So some defend the notion of liberal eugenics. So the difference is basically, according to a lot of these thinkers, that in the past, eugenicists would use state authority to impose forcibly a kind of standard notion of the good person, or of the at least biologically preferable type of makeup. And that vision led to a lot of government intervention, imposition, and so people were forcibly sterilized or highly encouraged and incentivized to breed with certain people rather than others.
Right.
Whereas those advocates of using current technologies or emerging technologies to improve the next species who are more comfortable with the kind of liberal eugenics, or what they might prefer to call just genetic optimization, to avoid the eugenic term completely. And this approach says basically, we are not imposing a certain view of biology or the good life. We are allowing reproducers to make choices. And in fact, we're actually empowering them to make more choices than if we were to just leave reproduction to the old-fashioned means of sexual intercourse, because that's so unpredictable and it can be so dangerous. So we're actually empowering people to have more choice, not less choice. So the approach is more liberal. Like I said, some embrace the term liberal eugenics as an alternative and as something very different from old eugenics. Others just want to get rid of the eugenics completely because they see eugenics as so tied to government authority and imposition and being so counter to their liberal views.
Totalitarian.
Right.
Yeah.
That they want to talk more in terms of genetic optimization. But again, something that's empowering for the reproducers. And then what I'm seeing more and more is this notion that it's also empowering for those who are produced, because you are freeing them, according to this mindset, from the burdens of disease, or at least greatly minimizing the potential of disease. You are giving them a better chance to develop certain characteristics, so that you're choosing embryos that have a greater likelihood of higher IQ or athletic ability or certain height or emotional capacities or altruism and empathy. Now, everyone knows that this polygenic sort of scoring is going to be limited. So we're not at this point of identifying exactly what each embryo will become or look like, because a lot of these desirable traits depend on this intricate interplay of various genes, plus so many environmental factors that we can't fully control.
Right.
But we can at least, according to these thinkers, get a better sense of those embryos that are less likely to have problems or complications and more likely to have desirable traits. So years ago, there was a lot of talk of the principle of procreative beneficence, this idea that parents have not just the kind of right or the opportunity, but even a certain moral obligation to use techniques like IVF and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to choose the best child with the best chance of the best life, because that's what good and responsible parents do, just like they choose the best schools, the best diet, and so forth for their children.
Because if you see your kid's going to have Down syndrome, why would you make them suffer like that? Right. Yeah.
It's considered irresponsible. And so this idea had been around for a while, but now it's getting a sort of boost, if you will, through developments in AI. You have companies like Orchid and Nucleus Genomics, for instance, that very clearly and publicly present their AI tools as ways of more precisely screening and predicting the characteristics that embryos will develop once they are born. and giving their parents an even greater sense, not only of which embryos are more likely to implant in the procedure, but the kinds of characteristics that will develop along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So companies like Nucleus Genomics say, we are in the business of genetic optimization, and we're leveraging these AI tools to give you a much more precise assessment, because these AI tools, which excel in detecting patterns associated with certain characteristics in children, they're able to give customers, if you will, a better sense of the product that they're investing in.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that this is going to give us a better kind of, at least a biologically better equipped next generation.
Right, in terms of educating them on their ignorance of... Well, do you think people are bought into it, though? Like, is it going to be something kind of people go along with and it'll hit a wall at some point? It seems like if you have... I feel like most people, or many people on the ground, have inherited a lot of, again, the presuppositions that drive the transhumanist movement anyways. Again, even if something like John Stuart Mill's philosophy of freedom and autonomy, it seems like it's already pretty easy for the transhumanist message to just kind of slip in for a general audience. Do you think most people are kind of bought in to some degree to this messaging anyways?
Yeah, I do think that a lot of us in Western societies are far more transhumanists than we think,
Mm-hmm.
even if certain people have never read a page of Nick Bostrom or Anders Sandberg or David Pierce or any of the others.
Right.
They're still, as you said, inherited a lot of these ideas, presuppositions. So I am concerned that sort of background radical dualism, where we separate the self from the body and treat the body as something that we basically manipulate according to our whims and the technological tools at our disposal. That sort of background sense that the self is this sort of bundle of perceptions, or this ongoing conscious experience, or this combination of beliefs and desires and memories and so forth, that's the real self that is worth preserving, and the body is sort of secondary or perhaps indifferent and maybe even disposable. Like, we might be able to preserve that self in some form of digital immortality apart from the body. I'm worried that these ideas have already been prepared and are more easy to embrace now. And certainly the tendency toward radical autonomy for grown adults at the expense of the autonomy of those who are weak, who are frail, and who do not manifest the kind of sophisticated expressions of personhood that we value, right? So it's easy to talk about, in these contexts, affirming and celebrating the autonomy of parents and giving them more choice from among embryos. But what's so often forgotten in this conversation is how many embryos are harmed. Those who are not chosen are frozen or destroyed. And so there's little talk about their autonomy, their rights, their dignity.
But they're, again, within this meta-narrative, you could say they're not persons. Like, they have to kind of create arguments for why they aren't. And they, again, they construct their own standards for what makes a human person anyways, within, again, the whole tapestry or framework of these borrowed ideologies that they have anyways. So, I mean, how would... Within that conversation, even, where does the church fall in trying to convince or argue for the personhood of these people? Because, again, if we're working completely different premises too for what constitutes human nature and the human person, is that a conversation we can even have at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at the beginning we can start to identify some of the tensions or inner contradictions of this view. For instance, a lot of proponents of the principle of procreative beneficence say that they want to remain neutral about what the good life is and neutral about metaphysical questions. They simply want to give more choices and empower reproducers and parents and others. But as we're seeing here, the very idea that you can mass produce embryos and decide which ones survive and which ones should be frozen or destroyed is already an implicit dismissal of their fundamental ontological dignity. Now, you can make an argument against that, and people like Peter Singer and others have made extensive arguments for why those particular humans are not yet at the state of persons. But even just to, before that, acknowledge that there is an inconsistency, that there's a claim to remain morally neutral and neutral about metaphysical claims about the identity of that embryo. And yet there's already a very implicit embrace of a controversial stance. There are plenty of people, including outside of the church, who are uncomfortable with the destruction of embryos because they see these as human beings who are persons and deserving of protection and care. So that's not a sort of theological argument. There's a philosophical argument to be made for that. But even before we make that philosophical argument, to say, hey, you're jumping to a conclusion here and you're presupposing something that you claim you're neutral about. Also to help them to see that this approach and principle can very quickly lead us to things that they might otherwise want to avoid. So I think about the fact that parents who are influenced by this idea, who dislike and correctly oppose racism or sexism, might sense a certain pressure and even responsibility in societies that fall into racism or sexism to actively choose embryos, children of a certain race or a certain sex. Not because they're racist or sexist, but because they don't want their children to suffer this kind of disadvantage that they consider an obstacle to a good life. So I think you end up with these strange kinds of tensions, contradictions when you try to follow the principle. But then eventually you want to get to the point where you say that the depriving personhood from beings that are widely recognized as being distinct biological entities of a particular biological species, who have a distinct genetic code, a unique sex, who have a kind of inbuilt trajectory of growth and development that will continue along a predictable path of maturity, from embryo to fetus onward to infant to adolescent and so forth. That to deprive personhood of that entity, of that member of a particular biological species, is ultimately arbitrary. And depriving personhood from human beings as a long and terrible history, we see that that's at the source of so many movements of racism or of genocide and so forth. To say these humans count, but these humans do not, or at least they do not count in the same way. I just don't think that we can find a non-arbitrary reason to deprive these biological human beings of the personhood label. And so I think at the very least, these thinkers should be willing to treat the embryo as a person, even if they may not embrace the full richness of our understanding of the infused soul. They certainly recognize that it'd be tremendously dangerous to say, simply because you do not fit a particular set of criteria that we've established about autonomous judgment or sense of self over time or choice or whatever it may be, just because you don't fit our particular criteria, you're not deserving of protection and worth. I just don't think that we can fairly make that case that these biological human beings are in a separate category.
Yeah. The term, you said it's procreational...
procreative beneficence.
Procreative beneficence, yeah. It seems like behind that, the messaging or even the philosophy behind it a lot of the transhumanistic arguments is it's not that we don't want to be, optimistic, but they seem to underlying their arguments, they assume the best of human nature. Like, if we just give people freedom, give them all the choice they need, they're going to choose the best options in every case, which is, it seems like you need more than that. So who's actually the one, educating on what is, in any given case when you're choosing what your kid is going to be like? What are the standards for choosing? Again, if it's just a purely autonomous thing, then again, it seems like we're all just living in a multitude of autonomous tyrannies in a way too. Like, again, if it's just the parents choosing for this other autonomous individual who doesn't actually have a say, even though they're choosing the best thing that they think is the best for this individual, but this embryo doesn't actually have a choice.
Right.
It just seems like, again, I guess a big problem would be assuming the best of human nature. And it's not that as Catholics we don't want to have a positive outlook on human life. We do. We have, one of the biggest with the resurrection and this idea of becoming like God. But within the interplay of human life, it seems like they have a very, again, the assuming the best of human nature. When I don't think if you look at history, you can take that stance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there are observers of transhumanism that have accused it of a sort of neo-Pelagianism. So the Pelagian heresy basically denied the existence of original sin and was convinced to some degree that we would be able, through our own efforts and discipline, to correct our human defects apart from grace and achieve salvation apart from that grace. So this sort of neo-Pelagianism comes up in contemporary transhumanism. Again, not because they're explicitly thinking in these theological terms, because they're often not.
But they might not even know that. They might be repackaging.
Right.
Again, it's like there's also the claim there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a repackaging of another heresy that we've seen before.
Right. And so there's this tremendous pressure, if you will, on them to figure this out, to get the next generation right. And there's even more urgency because some have a kind of apocalyptic vision of the impending doom that either climate change, nuclear warfare, misaligned super artificial intelligence might bring about. So there's this strong sense that we're kind of living in the end times, and that our tools and our capacities in a globalized world are so strong and affect so many people so quickly that we don't have much time left. Right. And so if we do not use all our efforts, all of our tools to enhance and improve and give everyone in the next generation as much an edge as possible, then we're further dooming ourselves. So there's such pressure to face up against the apocalypse by ourselves. And there's also this acute awareness of the effects of sin without really having the language or the vision of faith to understand the source of that. So they know that there's aging, sickness, suffering, and death, and they know that that's problematic. And we can join with them in saying, yeah, you're right. This is a big problem. There's something seriously wrong with us. Yeah. But they unfortunately often lack the vision of faith to be able to see the origin of that and to see the solution in divine grace. What is also a sort of twist of history is the fact that Catholic thinkers have been thinking about transhumanism for a while. We can go back to Dante, and in the first canto of the Paradiso, when he gets to paradise, he uses this term transhumanar, and he is using that term not about the kind of technological transhumanism we are familiar with today, but this kind of transhumanizing effect that grace has had on the saints. It has brought them beyond the limits of their human nature and allowed them to do what they couldn't do by themselves. The church acknowledges that the saints are the ones who live heroic virtue beyond merely human capacities, that we would not by our fallen human nature alone be able to achieve the kinds of excellence, heroism, over a period of time that we see in the saints. That's a manifestation. Their heroic virtues are manifestations of the gift of grace.
Yeah.
So Dante comes in and talks about transhumanar, talks about that going beyond. But it's a going beyond that does not set aside. It doesn't cast off the body so that our conscience can be liberated and uploaded so that we're free of the weakness and frailty of the body. It's rather a going beyond that also fulfills. It is a fulfillment, a realization of our embodiment, not a rejection of our weakness and our frailty and vulnerabilities as embodied creatures.
An interior renewal too.
Right.
Well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And you said you were a Newman person in your conversion too. But again, I think it's that even when he talks about, the development of doctrine, even in this kind of movement towards transhumanism in a Catholic sense, it's like, no, it's the perfecting of nature. Again, it's a very Thomistic thing to say grace builds upon nature. But at the same time, there's that quote from Flannery O'Connor where she's like, grace or human nature vigorously resists grace too.
Right.
So that struggle between the two, where it is perfecting, but it's also so alien in the same way.
Yeah, there's the surprise of Christianity. There is this shocking aspect of Christianity that we lose sight of. This idea of God, the infinite, the divine, the perfect, the eternal, taking on weak, frail, vulnerable human flesh in time. And then being humiliated, showing to the world, or at least to those who were present for the crucifixion, all of his weakness, all of the limits of humanity. And yet through that experience of vulnerability and through a horrible injustice, we see the triumph of Christ over death and over sin and this possibility of new life. Like, that's surprising. That's unexpected. It's very understandable that secular transhumanists are going to not quite grasp or understand what's going on there immediately, but it's that beautiful fulfillment, and in a way that exceeds a fulfillment of our deepest longings. Because the transhumanists, they show us that deep longing for a life that has been redeemed, that's been made right, a life that's corrected our sickness, our problems, our sufferings, even that deep longing for immortality, right? That they're grasping at by a protocol that will reverse your aging process, or by highly speculative forms of whole brain emulation, where we map out the connections of our neurons to try to capture the information and data about our brains, so that information of our consciousness can be transferred to different platforms or eventually uploaded to the cloud, right? All of those efforts, even the most speculative, wild ones, speak to that deep longing for immortality. And the shocking part of Christianity is, it says that can be fulfilled, but in a way that does not sidestep or avoid or do away with that body that seems to be the source of all of the weakness and the limits. It's actually a redemption of the body, because we're not just our consciousness, we're not just information or data. We're embodied creatures, body-soul composite, incarnate spirits. We have these dual dimensions that are profoundly united, and Christ comes to redeem all of that. So it's a really beautiful message that actually responds to the deepest desires, aspirations, and concerns of the transhumanists.
Moving and looking forward now at the trend of transhumanism, what do you think are going to be some of the biggest specific challenges that the church will need to address in the next 20 to 30 years?
Oh, the church is thinking very seriously about the future of work, what it will look like when more and more automation takes place in society, and when people are seen as perhaps less valuable in certain fields, this whole job displacement area. But I think beyond that, we're going to see the increasing spread of brain-computer interface. Many people are already familiar with the work that Elon Musk has done at Neuralink.
Right.
This chip has received FDA approval. Nolan Arbaugh and others have already received it. Thankfully, the current patients are able to regain a certain sense of autonomy, a certain capacity for communication, study, exploration through this chip. Nolan can control a cursor with his mind, and that allows him to research, allows him to play video games as well, which is fun, and then also to research, and people are given new abilities to communicate with loved ones. All of this is wonderful. But the second half of the mission statement is unlocking human potential, which is definitely a kind of transhumanist push.
Term too.
So to improve our cognitive bandwidth, that's the kind of thing that Musk has talked about. I don't even know if we're psychologically equipped to handle that kind of rapid increase in our bandwidth. I mean, I already feel a little overwhelmed now with my primitive cognitive bandwidth. Right. So I don't think we're ready necessarily for what he's promising. But aside from that, there are a lot of other companies that are moving toward this, which raises all sorts of security issues, raises fears about potential manipulation and distortion, raises also questions about social status and whether this will exacerbate different disparities among people. What happens if some are willing to gain the cognitive edge or boost that comes with brain-computer interface while others are reluctant? Will those others be left even further behind? How will we interact in society? How will this neurological information be used, for instance, in judging our guilt of certain crimes, our presumed guilt of crimes? And the brain-computer interface, remember, is not only the kind of invasive procedure that we have in Neuralink, where you're given a chip where the electrodes are exerted into your brain to get a better sense of the activity of your neurons. There are also forms of less invasive approaches. The MERGE labs from Sam Altman and company that propose to use ultrasound technology to detect blood flow in the brain associated with thoughts and so forth. And then I saw there's a new company that's putting out beanies, hats, these hats that you wear with EEG technology to kind of monitor and translate your thoughts into text.
I don't know. I still think the beer hats are better technology than that. But
well, now's the chance to promote them. Get into the market while you can. So all of these sort of things that sound very sci-fi are going to be very much of the church's concern, I say, in the near future.
Well, thank you for joining, Father. It's been a pleasure having you on. I know the transhumanism topic is very specific in some ways, but also broad because it covers so many things. Again, it's a sort of meta-narrative of its own, another quasi-religion. But thank you for joining. We end, as always, with a rapid-fire round. So
great.
No need. We won't go into these for too long, but just as quick as you can think.
All right. Word association. Love it.
Yeah. So 5 questions. First one, favorite pope of all time?
Ooh, John Paul II. We even have the same birthday. I can't resist.
No, I don't blame you for that one. Who is an underrated saint?
Oh, the forgotten ones. The ones we celebrate on All Saints' Day. Because we don't even know who they are.
Yeah, a bit underrated. Yeah. Favorite fact about the Vatican that you're allowed to tell me?
Ooh, am I allowed to tell you anything? Favorite fact about the Vatican.
We can't publish this episode if you do tell us.
Exactly. Oh, that's hard. Well, I just love the fact that you can actually go and pray with the Pope. Like, most people don't even know that you can get tickets to papal masses and pray with the Vicar of Christ. They think you have to pay money. So maybe that's the great fun fact is that the majority of great Vatican events and all of the papal experiences are free of charge. Yeah. So if someone tells you otherwise, they're scamming you.
Yep. One of those street vendors. All right. Give me your best hot take.
Ooh, I should have thought of this. I have to be like thrown into.
You don't have your party hot take? They always pull out.
I guess I have to.
The transhumanists are right.
Yeah, exactly. I have to be thrown into the right context. Oh shoot, best hot take here. Oh, maybe we can come back to that. What's your best hot take? Maybe I'll be able to contradict your best hot take.
I plead the fifth.
We're gonna edit this out later.
Right, yeah. All right. Finish this sentence. For Pete's sake, I wish people would
watch this episode.
Amen. Thanks for joining this Father Baggot. Please listen, subscribe, and follow our work. But thanks again for joining, Father. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here.